Stop allowing semantics to distract you. Or at least that's what we would like to say, but when we dig into the meaning of the word and we find out the depth of its content and its importance when we talk about logic and argument, semantics might not be the best word for this episode. Rather, more importantly, stop allowing generalizations to distract you. This is the Redacted Culture Cast, and we are already getting into the hundreds of episodes now. We're in the 100th, this should be 102. And for that, we thank you. Thank you for joining us along the show. Thank you for joining the conversation when we dig into some of the harder questions when it comes to violence and philosophy and morals and law and how we think about these things. In the age that we live in, we have certainly no shortage of fast, consumable content and plenty of conversation to be had about topical subjects that go by in the day-to-day, but I think that has left a void in the meaningful subjects. We can only be entertained so long until it no longer has that bite. And so in this episode, we are going to be engaging in a conversation that comes up quite frequently, especially on the social level, and we're going to analyze some of the statements made and how we actually think about those things and how the way we think about those things affects the way that we view the world. If you'd like to support the show, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com and join into the conversation with us on the deeper side of these subjects in a place where maybe the more front-facing side of social media would be less kind about it. As well as that, you get to support the show and keep us running, keep the lights on, keep the conversation flowing as we bring more and more of the intellectual side that we all have and we all carry to the gun culture conversation, as well as America, and as well as things that are very important to us, like meaning, purpose, and how we understand violence. That being said, let's get on to the show. Recently, Andy Stumpf appeared on Chris Williamson's show known as Modern Wisdom. And on that show, Stumpf has an opportunity to talk about gun culture in America. And in the conversation with Chris Williamson, Andy Stumpf, who is a veteran and who has a rather admirable military career, makes a series of statements, especially about people he has observed in gun culture. And one thing that Andy Stumpf does is he says something very quickly. He interjects to say, they want something to happen. And when the they he's referring to are, in a sense, directed at gun owners. And you'd think, why would a veteran, somebody of Andy Stumpf's media presence, he's been around a bit, this isn't his first time, and there is sometimes a controversy, I said that on purpose that way, that follows him around, and where we run into this reaction that comes from gun culture is oftentimes a rejection and frustration with somebody like him. How could somebody with your achievements say such a heretical thing to gun culture? He makes the statement, they want something to happen, referring to gun cultures who might be concerned about a potentially violent future for this country, or they're concerned about government tyranny, or they're concerned about culture war issues, or whatever the assumption is. The odd thing is that's how he decides to enter into the conversation. And what I believe this is I believe that this is a combination of a generalization and a caricature. There certainly are people within what we would call gun culture because there are no solid lines. There is no solid border. The fringes of gun culture are painted with a watercolor. But there are people, maybe even caricatures, many of us have met, who sometimes exhibit that odd willingness that might come from naivety and bravado that doesn't own up with the or doesn't measure up to the reality of the situation. A story that I've used a couple of times is this idea of like the Boogaloo Boys. Now, for most of gun culture, it was a joke. It was this kind of funny inside joke where we weaved Skyrim lore and video game terminology into kind of contemporary events as we saw things that were going on that did that, as usual, kind of look fishy. In fact, so many things are fishy, you'd think that things being uncomfortable would be the norm. But somehow we go back to our day-to-day. But if you look across the landscape of gun culture, and if you look long enough and hard enough, you will find people, usually specific people, who speak a little too openly about things that border on fantasy, things that border on the kind of things that you don't say in public, that it might be best had conversations between close friends behind closed doors where you can have that genuine approach of saying, hey, I'm going to say some things that are uncomfortable, but I'm trying to wrestle with these ideas and I have these concerns and I'm looking for advice. And the internet's not going to like it. And if you turn that into a generalization, people are not going to be able to respond to it because they don't have rapport with you. They don't know what your temperaments are and what your concerns are, and they don't know you. And so they'll easily be taken out of context and thrown to the wind to turn into political statements used by opponents who probably don't have your goodwill in mind to paint you as a caricature of something you're not. And we all are aware of this kind of conversation because when we're talking about subjects that include violence, there isn't an easy way to get to it. There isn't an easy way to approach the subject that doesn't cause moral questions to arise about the speaker's character. And so if you look hard enough in gun culture, you can find some people who are suspiciously casual about their perceptions of violence and their considerations of violence, or their as Andy Stumpf says, hungry for it. However, here's an interesting inversion of the generalization that I think Andy Stumpf made a mistake on. That is by no means exclusive to gun culture. And somehow later in his conversation, he makes a statement that we have talked about on this show before. And he says something like this, paraphrase. In the end, people that he knows who are good at violence want nothing to do with it. That's near the end of the segment where he's talking to Chris Williamson about the people he knows who's capable of violence. Characters like Mike Glover, who's been on the show, comes up, and some other people talk about it, and then they move into a conversation on CrossFit. And Andy Stumpf makes this interesting argument, if you listen to the whole segment, that he says they, without defining who they are hungry for violence, but the people that he knows who are capable of it are not interested in being involved. And what I think this is where I think Andy Stumpf is wrong. I think that he sees himself in some senses in the minority, whereas that attitude of the people that I know who are good at violence are not participating in it, I think is the norm. Now, how would we measure the norm? We could do polling and questions, but if you're to call up somebody from a 1-800 number and ask them about their who they know who's interested in violence, you're going to be called a Fed, and probably for good reason, because it's a weird question to call somebody you don't know and ask about. But the question is, why did we bring up semantics and generalizations at the beginning? Well, on the one hand, we have a semantic argument here. He's talking about they, the many, hungry for, concerned about, and he's talking about this implication that that the representation, the caricature of the individual who, as he describes, views the firearm as a magic wand, is a reasonable representation of the population. And while this statement could be, let's just say, sharpened into a more useful conversation, and it's not criticism. This is a criticism of Andy in the sense of, I know what you're saying, I've heard you say it before, and you keep saying the same thing over and over again, and I believe that you're misrepresenting gun culture in the generalization of the populace. And so in this conversation here, we're addressing, in this show here, we're addressing the very specific problem, which is not alone what Andy said about things, but also how do we think about it? How do we think about this subject of potentialities of violence, and how do we think about issues dealing with the hard moral questions surrounding such? You could make the statement, and you could follow along with Andy, where he goes into an argument and he talks about how most people in this class he observed would have ended up in jail, or suffered under civil court, probably failed in a civil lawsuit. And you could see that you could see the foundation of the argument that's built underneath that, and that is something to do with um, you may win the fight but lose the you may win the battle but lose the war, because you may survive in a sense. You may defend yourself or view yourself as defending yourself, and then ultimately end yourself on the wrong side of the law. And he doesn't go in anywhere, and this is common from this style of talking about gun culture. He doesn't go anywhere to talk about what are the moral implications of such things. Is there a scenario where you engage in violence, and you find yourself on the wrong side of the law, but still are acting morally? You are still in the moral position. That is a hard question, because it very quickly can turn into grandizement of the criminal or praise of the outlaw. And we've talked a little bit about the difference between a criminal and an outlaw in the past. But the argument here, and the issue that I brought up earlier as a criticism, is I don't think that Andy is talking about the general population of gun culture or firearms owners. There are certainly people who do, in his sense, see the firearm as a magic wand, but those people are very rarely the individuals who are well-trained or even capable or have the integrity to become competent and capable with a firearm. And oftentimes there's a sense of naivety into it on the innocent side, or just ignorance or foolishness or malice or something baked into the cake. The people who see the firearm as a tool of power most often are like the man making a noise in the metaphorical bar, that the bar fight scene that all of us know about but very few of us have seen. And that's that bar fight scene where the guy who's making all the noise, and we see this recreated in film all the time, the braggart of sorts, is not the one in the room who's capable. John Lovell's talked about in the past is that, the most dangerous man in the room is the quiet one who knows what he's doing. And this motif comes up in film and video. You have it in characters and so much more. But the question then comes into is what is the moral question that we're dealing with? Now, there's an imperative contained in Andy's argument, is that people, when they buy a firearm, should be required, or in some sense of the matter, have attached to the purchase of a firearm, include a safe or some way of storing it safely. Now, this is a good idea, especially for those with children in the home, and we can extend that question further of, depending on where you live, generally speaking, it's always a better position to be in to have a safe storage location for your firearm, and some sort of protocol or understanding for those in the house on what's there and what's available. The hard question for many will be, what about guests, or the guests of their children, their children's friends? And these are hard questions to ask, but they must be answered. The problem with his argument is that his solution to the, let's just say, generalization of gun culture being a little too, as we joke about it, gung-ho for a potential negative outcome, is to require of them, maybe even culturally without it being a legal requirement, something more on the lines of safety. And this is where I wonder if he's coming out of touch with some of gun culture, as in he's coming out of touch with the level of experience and skill that is represented across so many of the people that we encounter. Sure, we all know people who are new to the sport or new to the activity or new to the interests, who are learning things. They don't know how to. They keep forgetting to keep their finger off the trigger, which is not a good thing. It needs to be corrected. But the problem is, Andy is not unfamiliar with the attitude of bringing down everyone to the lowest common denominator. This is a double-edged sword, because when you're working in an operational environment that he's familiar with, your team really is only as strong as the weakest link. If you have to climb the mountain and one guy is not in physical fitness to do it, he's going to drag everybody behind, not even by their not even by physical ropes, but by the moral ties that he has to. He's sort of holding their integrity, their sense of morality hostage because he can't keep up and they have to slow down because they have the integrity not to abandon him. But there's another side to this. And now what happens when that attitude of defining the element by making the lowest common denominator the norm becomes the issue? The argument goes like this. You have two cases or two examples of the same thing, right? So if we make a statement like the team is only as strong as its weakest link, what that is saying is that there is that the capabilities of the unit are limited by those with the least competency, might be the harshest way to say it. But what that is not saying and what is not getting assumed is that everybody in that team is of the same skill level. And so when we paint this in the line of gun culture, if you're going to go with the, corporate approach, the corporate punishment or corporate punishment, let's just use that word. It might be a little bit off. But are you going to punish all of gun culture for the actions of a few fools? We are going to instinctively say no. But if you look a little bit deeper, we're going to also say yes. Because we say that we are responsible for one another, and if we claim that we are responsible for one another, we are looking out for one another, that we want to be in community with one another, like the conversation that we had with Jack Donovan about how he was wrestling with the responsibilities and requirements of being a part of a group, the things that you have to put on and put off, the things that you might not say so that you remain in the good graces of the group. And if that group is broad, it's gun culture and so on and so forth. What we recognize is that we are sort of simultaneously responsible, but not responsible for the actions of other people's. We might be morally responsible for those in our midst in the sense of we take responsibility for them because we are in community with them. But that doesn't mean that we are legally responsible for all the actions that they take. And that is the important line that we have to walk. So when we come back to this, why are we talking about semantics? Why are we talking about generalizations? Well, one, stop allowing generalizations to distract you is not just a quippy term. What I mean by that is that we speak very often in generalizations. They, those people, the gun culture, the left, the right, these people, those people, the World Economic Forum, or whatever you want to talk about, and the government, the ATF, right? And what we end up doing is we end up distracting ourselves from being efficacious in these environments that we are navigating, whether they be intellectual experiments or the very real physical world. And we do so when we are not acknowledging the generalizations that we're making and where the limit of that generalization ends, where the utility of that generalization ends. And so in an example of when Andy is talking to Chris Williamson, these are certainly two very public individuals, and they have this opportunity to have this really good conversation. The challenge that I run into with Andy's conversation is that for a person with such a platform and in such a large position, I think you can do better in having a good tune or being more in tune with American gun culture. If you're going to represent us publicly, I'm going to ask you to take the time to get to know us better. It's not that you're entirely on the outside. You certainly have your laurels, and there's many things to respect somebody like Andy on. But the issue that we're running into, and the opportunity that you've given gun culture to observe, is that in the time that has passed over the last 10 years, over the last 20 years, the bottom line acceptable skill level of gun culture has raised considerably. And by solving it with community, by spending time with one another, holding each other accountable, looking after each other, humbling ourselves before one another, we are raising the bar to make the criticisms leveled, maybe just by implication, invalid. Generalization is a tool that's often used in sort of political and cultural conversations. The infamous they is the easiest example. And the idea that people will buy a gun and use it as a Harry Potter wand, as presented in this conversation, is a interesting form of rhetoric to choose. Because if that is your impression of the people that you're supposedly representing in this video, because you're asked about it by a person who does interviews regularly, why is that the assertion that you start with representing gun culture? Now, for those of us who listen to that, maybe maybe how we start looking beyond the generalizations and looking beyond, in some sense, the semantics of it. But maybe the answer, and I will argue the answer, in fact, I imply the answer, is when somebody of his position makes that criticism, the first thing we should do is a small amount of introspection. Most of us will realize that maybe we have exhibited those traits in the past but have moved on, or, hey, let me be clear, am I actually seeing this as a get out of struggle free card? Do I really see that violence is the answer? And it's not that you get those quippy, pacifistic statements that violence is never the answer. Of course, these generalizations are ridiculous. They don't mean anything in the real world. We know this. When we hear it, it just turns sour in the air. But we know that it's not that somebody is something as simple as violence is never the answer. We know that that's just not real. We know that that is an ideology or it is an excuse. It's kind of like saying, I have to answer a difficult question and I'm just going to choose the cheapest, least effort, energy answer possible. I need to make dinner and I'm going to make the cheapest, least healthy answer possible. It's a shortcut. It's a shortcut that doesn't even deliver. We know this. We know this very clearly. And so when we think about how our ethical framework functions in regards to subjects of violence, that's where we are solving it. And the fact that we're talking about it now, I think, I imply, I argue, is the antithesis to Andy Stumpf's statements. So what does this mean going forward? Carry on. We're doing the right thing. Not everyone's going to notice. But do what is right because it is right, not because it works, let's just say. Do what is right, not because you're going to be acknowledged for it, but because it is right. And sometimes doing what is right happens in quiet conversations of earnest behind, away from social media, with friends, with people who you can trust. And that will require you to build that relationship up in a meaningful way so you can actually have that discussion. And while it may not get the media attention that overgeneralized, grandiose statements make, it will produce the outcome we are looking for. And that is, if you want to have something as important as meaning, you're going to have to pursue it yourself. So, this has been the Redacted Culture Cast, addressing the subject of generalizations in conversation. One of these days, we're going to get into the more rhetorical, or the more nitty-gritty argument when it comes to semantics. But until then, keep your hatchet sharp and your powder dry.